Good day to all of you joining us on Zoom on this webinar. I'm Sujata Gamagi. My colleague, Dr. Tara Dimel, and I co-coordinate this forum. We are an independent forum. Our mission is very simple, sounds very simple. It is catalyzing policy reforms. Actually, catalyzing policy reforms is one of the most difficult things to do. In our part of the world, policy is almost politics. But we feel that policies are too important to be left to politicians, and that civil society has to play a strong role, and Education Forum tries to fill that role. We hold policy dialogues once a month on average on a topical subject. These dialogues are usually exploratory in nature. Then we follow these up with more in-depth studies to produce policy briefs and inform policymakers and the public. We had this is the 13th one, and we'll have the policy briefs are just coming out. This dialogue is going to be particularly important because the government is set to introduce major curricular reforms to be announced on 26th of March. These initiatives are actually some of the things that we've always talked about: reduce examinations, reduce content, and make education more holistic to develop a wholesome child, wholesome citizen. But we know that all the nice things are there, but the implementation is always a problem. And there's always this issue that if we are going to reduce the number of, say, hours spent in school on preparing for exams, for example, right now, of the 6 to 7 hours they spend in school, 90% is on subjects. For example, grades 6 to 10 have 13 subjects. And these school days completely taken up by those. And all these subjects, even health and physical education, students are tested once a term, all three terms, and end of year exams, and so on. So, but if you take the plan, I think is to have 60% of the time spent on preparing for exams. We can't get away from exams altogether. But then how are we going to, what are we going to do with the rest of the time? There really has not been enough discussion on this. So this is where I think this dialogue on social emotional learning is very important. Social emotional learning perhaps should be one major part of how these curricular reforms, once you take the exams out, how we fill the rest of it. How do we make the more education more holistic, and what do we include into it? I think this social emotional learning component is going to play a strong role, but there's really no good understanding or discussion on the issue. So I think it's going to be a very important webinar in that sense. So today we'll be talking about what is social emotional learning, how do we impart those, and is it possible to assess, or should we even assess? Today we may not get answers to the last two parts, how do we impart or how do we assess, but more of a general sense, more of understanding, clearer understanding through our keynote and different perspectives from our panelists. So I'm very pleased that we have excellent, one of the best panelists I can think of. Dr. Anand Durayappa is the director of Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development in India. It's a UNESCO institute. And if you search for on Google, actually I did this, mainstreaming social and emotional learning, that's the first name that comes up. So I think that explains, I don't need to explain further. And the panel is Dr. Tara Dimel. She's the co-coordinator of the Education Forum, of course, but she was the former Secretary, Minister of Education, responsible for some significant reforms in our education system, and founder member, Mindful Educators Sri Lanka. Then Ms. Sonam Palden, Emotional Development Coordinator, the Royal Academy, Bhutan. And when you say Bhutan, the gross national happiness comes to mind. and Mr. Matthew McGregor-Stubbs, Research Director, International Assessment, National Foundation for Education Research. That's one resource I think you all I suggest you go to if you want to get up-to-date information on not just UK, but globally. So then we have, after the panelists, after the keynote speaker, we'll have the panelists coming on, each for maximum 15 minutes. The keynote speaker can be 20 minutes. Then we have a discussion. It's moderated by myself and Kavinda Thinnakon, who is an advisor to Education Forum Sri Lanka. She's currently in San Francisco at Stanford, and she's joining us at a very early hours in the morning. But she will be co-moderating the discussion with me. We'll be taking questions from the chat box. So it's a webinar format. It's different from our regular meeting format. We wanted this because we wanted simultaneous interpretation of these very important presentations and the discussions we are going to hear. So I think without further delay, I think I would ask Anand to unmute himself and start his presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Sujata. So I've started my time. I like to keep always to the time to be fair to the rest of the team. I start with a slide which actually was relevant pre-COVID, but I think with the experience of COVID now just past over a year, I think these are more, they have actually grown in terms of their impact and the criticality that we need to take into account. The first is the anxiety, the depression, and as Sujata has already said, we seem to be an exam-driven society where we need measurements and we need to measure against others. I always sort of say that we need to evaluate how we have learned, but I always like to use the benchmark as myself or the individual. How much have you learned within yourself from the past rather than always trying to compare it with someone else? And that kind of takes away, I believe, a lot of the pressure. And one of the things that we put this up even before COVID was there was a 2015 study by the WHO, and it was very sobering results where, and this is just for India, but it was very prevalent across the world. And for India itself, it sort of said that between the ages of 13 and 15, 25% of the kids have some form of mental health problem. Now that's our future. Those are our future generation. And when I think back, 13 to 15 years old, I think a kid should be having fun. We shouldn't be in a state of depression and anxiety, and even thinking of suicide. And I think for a large extent, it's our school system that has been a primary driver of that whole this whole trend. The second is the intolerance and violence, and this has really come to surface, especially with the events unfolding in the United States. But I don't think it's just the United States. I think it's all over the world. This whole notion of racism has finally been brought to the fore where we can talk about it openly rather than sort of think that it's, it was always the white elephant in the room, wasn't it? It's something that we really felt uncomfortable talking about. But I think with the Black Lives Matter and many of the other initiatives, I think we are really coming to terms and really seeing how, without even understanding or even without thinking that we might have been racial or a racist without, subconsciously. And there's this whole growing violence behind it. And as a Gandhi Institute, we think that this is something that we really need to address very quickly. And then the third one is, of course, our wicked problems, such as climate change, migration, biodiversity loss. And these are just going to increase as we as a society do not do anything other than, and I always say, make huge proclamations and sort of announcements on World Environment Day and World Climate Day, and then yet we go back to business as usual. I see a disturbing trend Now with COVID we're kind of coming out and seeing the light. Countries are saying we need to increase our GDP back to 7%, 8% gross domestic product. That means we're back into the same kind of mindset where we're going to start producing, increasing consumerism. We're using the wrong indicators, and for some reason, we don't seem to want to shift away from that indicator. And I'm very happy to see Bhutan here in sense of the the gross happiness index. I'm an economist by training, and I'm always surprised to sort of see countries use the GDP when Simon Kuznets, who actually developed the gross domestic product, warned us not to use this indicator as a measure of welfare or well-being. It is just about economic efficiency. But Lord behold, we are using it as a measurement of human progress. And I think that's a very dangerous trend, and we need to look at. And the fourth one, and I think COVID is really now pushing quite a bit, is this whole thing about privatization of what I think should be a social good or a public good. The whole, the rise of education, the cost, it's primarily becoming more and more private schools are being set up with this false understanding that you get a better education, and then with a better education, you get better jobs and so forth and so on, and you get into the vicious cycle. So these are, I think, some of the major issues that we need to look at. Now, if I go to the second slide, I've taken too much than what I should have on that first slide. This is our current education system. I don't think we need to go through this. Most of us have gone through this process, rote memorization. The way we teach is about memorization. I remember sitting for my O-levels and A-level exams, and it was all about memorization. It was not about understanding the beauty of calculus. It was all about memorizing to do first-order differential equations without really understanding why am I doing this. And then only much later, when I was, and I'm seriously saying much later, when I was doing my PhD, when I finally understood the beauty of calculus and what it means on a day-to-day, how I could use it for my day-to-day activities. So, we need to bring the relevance of that right down at the very beginning. The whole thing about one size fits all. I learn differently. I like to do things in a different way, but we have standardized it across all students, fitting, I always say, the 10 to 15%, and the remaining 85%, and I put myself under the 85%, who have to struggle and have to fit into this box that has been made for not the average. I don't believe it's for the average. I think it is made for a very small group of people, the 15 to 20%. And then, of course, the standard assessments, same thing. We all go and sit for that 3-hour exam after a whole year of studies. I'm not sure whether that's the way to evaluate learning. I think, well, I don't think I have to say I'm not sure. The sciences of learning already have enough evidence to say that this does not measure learning. And I don't still understand why we still continue with these. We still continue with this PISA. We continue with TIMSS. And we have again and again scientists who have worked on this sort of saying it doesn't do what you want it to do. And yet policymakers continue. We need to change. We can't keep saying we need to change and not do anything about it. And so that's where I go to the next slide, please. So what do we need? I go to the next slide. An education for human flourishing. I'm not sure if you realize it, but our education is for human capital. And how do we calculate human capital? The way that economists do, and how it goes into the system of national accounts, and that's where your funding and policy making is made on education. It's based on the literacy level, the numeracy level, the enrollment ratio, and you multiply it by the wages. Can you see how disconnected that whole indicator is? It has nothing to do with the whole notion of flourishing. And flourishing is also a loaded word. And we are running now an assessment, an education assessment bringing in about over 150 scientists to talk about the state of education and the sciences behind it. And we came up with the definition of flourishing. I would like to sort of repeat that, and you can access this online. It's the optimal continuing development of human beings' potentials and living well as a human being, which means being engaged in relationships and activities that are meaningful, that is aligned with both our own values as well as humanistic values in a way that is satisfying to them. So you also have agency involved. It's not a top-down dictatorial approach, but agency is important in that. Flourishing is conditional on the contribution of individuals and requires an enabling environment as well. So education, I see, is a great way of how you could achieve this, but you have to design a system, an education for human flourishing, not for human capital. And it's an education that is rooted in kindness. I had the title of this, my traditional title, but I changed it. I thought I won't be so provocative this time. My usual title is Education Predators to Nurturers, because I always assert that our education system is one of the best predatorial training grounds that we have. We train predators right from the time we introduce them to a formal education system. Predators because we want to get over better to the next person. It's all about the race to the top. So it is about nurturers and a new approach based on science and evidence. It's not about anecdotal or what we think it is right for our students. It has to be rooted in the sciences of learning, which we know a lot these days. There's so much of work which has been done by the neuroscientists and the neuroscientists in terms of how the brain works, how working memory is developed, how long-term memory is developed, how do we retain information, how do we pull out information in different situations. We know how all that works. So education should be informed by that and by evidence itself. Next slide, please. So it's about an integrated process. So the rational and the emotional pathways of the brain. What I say is that most of our systems right now have focused on rational. It's about providing the information. Even when you talk about socio-emotional learning, I see in so many cases, we teach the children what socio-emotional learning is, but we don't teach them how to practice it. That's a different thing altogether. So it is always a rational approach. Now, we all know now, and in fact, this is work done by Daniel Kahneman, who was a psychologist, but actually won a Nobel Prize in economics. It's about that we don't make our decisions in a rational way. In fact, Dan Ariely wrote a beautiful book called Predictably Irrational. So the whole notion of rationality is not, so but it's not only emotions as well. It's an interplay between the two. I don't like to say the emotional brain and the rational brain, because it is about a network which connects all of them. So it's about building not only the cognitive, the rational dimensions, but also building the emotional. We think emotions can't be trained. Again, science says we can, and there's convincing evidence to say that we can. Next slide, please. So this is the network that we would like to activate. We tend to call it the Gandhi neuron network. So it's an interplay between critical inquiry, which is the cognitive, but again, is very different from just taking information. It is about getting information from a critical questioning process. And then you have the whole notion of attention regulation, sensory motor skills. Next slide, please. Right. And can we go back? Yeah. So this is the network where we building the emotional, the empathy, compassion, the mindfulness, and with the cognitive. Social and emotional learning is not just about the emotional dimensions. It also includes the cognitive dimensions. You can't separate them. It needs to be integrated. And that's why we have kind of designed something called the EMC squared. As you can see, I'm a fan of maths and science, so I couldn't resist Einstein's equation. And I keep saying Einstein got it wrong by saying E equals to mc squared. It's actually EMC squared, because that's what happens in this 3-pound thing that we carry between our ears. Next slide, please. So the good news is that these, and this is actually quite new, this whole development of neuroplasticity, which means networks can be created throughout our life. Of course, neuroplasticity is at its peak till the age of 24. This is when it is really active. You can create all these new networks between the cognition and the emotional dimensions. But the good news is that even old buggers like me, I always call myself in that category, can still learn. We can still create new networks. It's a little bit slower, but that's okay. It's not a lost case. But the good news is that networks of hate, networks of racism can, if trained, basically disappear, and new networks of empathy, new networks of compassion can be created through the classroom, through the intervention of socio-emotional learning, through the training of the brain. Next slide, please. So this is the framework that we use. I'm not sort of saying that this is the only framework you should use. There are many other frameworks. Cassell, which is one of the pioneers in socio-emotional learning, have their own framework. What we thought was we wanted to make a distinction between foundational competencies, socio-emotional competencies, which we think are empathy, mindfulness, and compassion, which then build method competencies like collaboration, team building, and so forth and so on, which Cassell talks about. All are important. So as you see, we have the critical inquiry as well here. What we do is when we train socio-emotional learning, we take a topic. So we could take a topic of, let's say, violence, and sort of then deconstruct and saying, so what do you mean by violence? So you go and read up, there's different interpretations. Then you got the whole notion of justified violence. Now, seems to be oxymoronic. How can you justify violence? But there is a whole literature on that. So we kind of bring that in. Depending on the age of the child, you need to then be very careful in the level of complexity that you bring in. So it's very, very important when you do socio-emotional learning is to understand which particular age group that you are targeting, and then design the curriculum accordingly. And so with that, when we go through that whole notion, that intellectual exercise on violence, then we sort of intervene by sort of saying, so what are your emotions right now when you read this? What are your emotions when you see this kind of violence being enacted against a certain group of people? And so then they start to understand what emotions are. And one of the things that people always tend to make a mistake is, we don't say emotion regulation does not mean emotion suppression. It is about understanding your emotions. So anger, we always say anger is okay. You shouldn't try to suppress it, but it's to understand why. And once you get an understanding of why, then you can start to react and to start to train your mind on addressing that. Next slide, please. So this is the process that we call the Libre process. And this is what I want to sort of emphasize, that what we have in the COVID, we have gone digital. But I think we have not done is we have not taken the advantage of what the digital world can offer. What we have done is what we do in the classroom, and we have just taken it and put it into the digital, and in fact doing a worse job at it. But the digital offers a great opportunity where you can have discussion dialogues across borders. Of course, you don't have the face-to-face in terms of in the classroom. But if you want to really build global, like if you want to address climate change, global migration problems, violence, which cuts across borders, you really need people to talk across different cultures. You need to talk across different countries. So the digital world allows that. And we have done that really well with a program called DICE, which is a digital intercultural dialogue or exchange. And we have got countries, 5 countries from very different, the US, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Norway. And then you get kids talking about the whole issue of migration. It was so interesting to understand their different perceptions. And then after discussions, coming to an understanding of why migration happens, and an understanding and a respect and a sense of empathy for migrants, and then doing something about it, which is the compassion part. So you can have games, which is something that is a favorite of mine. I use this as an excuse because I love playing digital games.
You have 1 minute more, Anand.
Right, video games. So I took an advantage and said, hey, let's use games in our curricula. And we use quite a number of digital games, private games, and companies are quite okay to allow us to use and develop a curriculum around it. And we introduce SEL through those games. Next slide, please. So a call to action. Of course, I'm going to say sign up on our learning platform. It's called framerspace.com. Just go in, check it out. See if you like it. If you don't like it, tell us why. If you like it, also tell us why. Enroll in our global citizenship course, but we have now lots more courses. So it's kind of grown over the time since that Framerspace came on. And then on the action compassion part, establish kindness clubs. And we're having a major initiative. I would say go on to the website and see how you can get involved. Now, my 3 cents worth that I would like to say, if I can indulge in 1 minute, Sujata, of extra time. Next slide, please. So we must nurture both the rational and emotional parts, building emotional intelligence and resiliency. Mainstream SEL, don't bring it as a subject alone, but mainstream it across the whole school and the school community. And then acts of kindness, which is the action part, guided and supported in a mindful, empathetic, and critical manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. I think I will then now go direct to our panelists. First, Dr. Tara Dimel. Tara, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sujata, and thank you very much, Dr. Anantha, for that excellent presentation. I don't think I have much to say since everything I was going to say you have said already, but let me try nevertheless. So my presentation is going to take just 3 or 4 components. The first is actually to unpack social emotional learning and try to make the principles of SEL as simple as possible. I'd also like to emphasize how this can be used as a preventive tool rather than a therapeutic function to address situations like violence and all the aggression we see in schools and in society. And I'll also like to show you, to describe some of the few things we've done in Sri Lanka with significant results and what we are planning to do in the future on this same subject. So first, let me unpack social emotional learning. I know it's a relatively new term. It boils down to self-awareness or mindfulness with the other traits that was described by our keynote speaker, like the interpersonal skills, the self-control, critical thinking, empathy, kindness, compassion, and all those positive mental traits. So self-awareness or mindfulness is, I would like to present as the core or the pivot on which all these other components rest. And I say this with some reason. So mindfulness is something that came into the vocabulary of the Western and the Eastern developed world just about 30 or 40 years ago, but it's as old as 2,600 years ago. And it came from India, from the Buddha and his teaching. So mindfulness, I want to present as the linking point, the tool which helps to develop these positive emotions and the other positive mental traits that were described. So, what I just want to take you back a few decades actually to show you how mindfulness became the root of all these positive emotions. And this picture shows you in the center His Holiness the Dalai Lama and this famous neurologist, neuroscientist, Dr. Richard Davidson, whom the whole world knows and who's done a volume of work on these subjects that we are talking today. So this is when His Holiness challenged Professor Richard Davidson, he's a young man in this picture, to demonstrate through functional MRI and other neuroimaging techniques how mindfulness and other positive mental training will change structurally, will change the brain. And that led to the scientific revolution, which Dr. Ananthan also described. This also shows how His Holiness took with him to the United States, to Dr. Richard Davidson's lab in the University of Wisconsin, a team of Tibetan lamas, those who have been practicing mindfulness, compassion, and empathy for decades. And he tested their brains. And now we have the evidence of the responses that the brain showed positively. And this picture is really to show this French molecular biologist, Dr. Matthew Ricard, who himself was a compassion meditation trainer for decades and who himself became a subject of that very famous first set of experiments. So, all of that went to show exactly what our keynote speaker said about neuroplasticity and the lifelong capacity of the brain to change and rewire itself, and similarly, neurogenesis. That means when the brain is taught something repeatedly, there is an ability to change. And this is quite in contrast to what we learned as medical students some 40 odd years ago. We were taught the brain does not change, no neurons will ever generate. So things change, and this was demonstrated by Richard Davidson and his team. Now, this is where I want to show the connect between mindfulness as a link to, for example, critical thinking. Prefrontal cortex. This is one area which is responsible for critical thinking, for wise decisions, for sensible organizational management and decision making. So the prefrontal cortex is developed and becomes more functional with mindfulness training. The amygdala, on the other hand, although it's a tiny structure that sits at the foot of the two main cerebral hemispheres, is aroused when detecting and reacting to emotion. In fact, it's called our reptilian brain because we react and not respond. We fault find, we judge, we get angry, become fearful. Whereas with mindfulness training, the amygdala becomes less functional and will become even smaller in size. So there again, connection, what I mentioned. Similarly, the hippocampus, which is really critical to learning and memory, but it also helps to regulate the amygdala. So we see that all these positive emotions, the ability to be more respectful, more tolerant, and not to be violent and react, could come or will come with mindfulness practice. And this has been shown without any doubt through the functional MRIs and the other neuroimaging techniques over the years. So this is just a famous term popularized by Daniel Goldman, that the amygdala hijacks our happiness. There again, I mean, it's the same thing. It's a seat of our most fearful emotions, but a mind trained in mindfulness can manage the amygdala and not make us reptilian, instead make us more human. So I just want to share that with you, just to confirm the connection of mindfulness with these other positive traits. And what I want to present to you is that I would like to suggest mindfulness can be the seat of a social emotional learning platform. And I'm saying this with a lot of reason. Social emotional learning as a basket of subjects or teachings, I feel, cannot be taught as subjects, cannot be tested at exams, and cannot be graded or, ask students to grade themselves on these particular areas. Our thesis is that with the kind of work we have done, which I will describe in a minute, we found that educators and teachers who are exposed to mindfulness showed for a while, this was an 8-week study, showed how well their management of emotions was, showed how well they were able to be kind, compassionate, and empathetic with their peers and their staff. So let me quickly show you one preliminary study we did when mindfulness was first launched in the school system. It's a program called Satipasala. We just tested as a very preliminary study 232 students and 63 teachers who went through some mindfulness training through their teachers. And in the case of the students, you could see these two pie charts, the one on the left, how more than 69% of students talked about their ability to be more composed, ability to work in a more organized manner, memory. And if you look at the teachers' feedback, they also gave a similar feedback on the advantages of being mindful, with about 59% talking about the ability to be more composed and less reactive, and also being able to work in a more organized manner. In that same study, yeah, in the same study, we also did an evaluation of the students about how they perceived their friends to be. And there we found that, if they found friends with their friends, they were less irritated. There was a better capacity to study, again, improvement of memory. And when it came to the 63 teachers, they showed how the behavioral changes were more positive, so over 70%, with improved attention and academic improvements together. So we found repeatedly, this is a study that was done somewhere in 2016. But since then, with every intervention, we have seen how much all these elements, which we now talk of as social emotional learning, can come through a mindfulness program that is consistently introduced to students, coupled with this set of values like kindness and empathy and ethics education. One, I just want to give you an example of one of my colleagues who was a very senior mindfulness teacher in Plum Village, who mentioned how in a program she was conducting with teachers, how important it was for the teacher's conduct, the teacher's demeanor, the teacher's behavior to be, in order to convey that to the children. So she mentioned when she was doing this training program, it was in New York City, in one of the most, a more impoverished area of New York City, and a very boisterous school. And this particular class, where this particular teacher who every day walks into class, and she's greeted with so much of shouting and boisterous behavior of the students, she was almost giving up. She had done mindfulness practice on her own with kindness practices and so on. So she one day thought of trying out an experiment. So what she did was she walked into the class with a mind jar, which I think most of you know about. It's a jar with water and some glitter. When you shake it, the jar is very turbid. It's like our minds when we are very discursive and cluttered. So she kept the mind jar on the table in front of her, allowed the glitter to settle, and like the thoughts in our mind, which are very discursive, turbulent, so the mind thoughts too settled like the glitter. The first day, only just one or two children decided to follow her example. By the second, third day, every time she walks into class, she uses this mind jar and sits silently and breathes in and out. She found within a week the entire class became what she was, which was settled, composed, and mindful. That was just to give you an example. So I just like to say one country that has really done well in this, and I always refer to the Mindfulness Initiative in UK and the Mindful Nation UK program, which I'm sure most of our people in the audience would know. So for the first time, mindfulness was introduced into the mainstream policy of the House of Commons with bipartisan agreement from both sides of the divide. And they decided to mainstream mindfulness, not just in education, but in the health sector, in the criminal justice system, and in the labor workforce or in labor. So these three universities did the initial research studies, and 8-week mindfulness training was introduced into the parliament. And the MPs themselves were convinced that they got an opportunity, like a window, a policy window, to be able to discuss with their colleagues without confrontation and aggression. So they saw it firsthand, how much mindfulness led to these positive traits. So we at Mindfulness Educators, we are also going to attempt a program with Arigato International. It's a program that, it's an organization that focuses on ethics education. We are trying to introduce mindfulness with all these positive traits, but without the label of social emotional learning, to educators. We're starting with a pilot project with some teachers and then trying to roll it out within our education system. So here the aim is to make teachers, educators, provincial education authorities understand the importance of mindfulness and these attendant traits, which Anant described very illustratively as firing the Mahatma Gandhi neurons, which was loving kindness, empathy, compassion. I mean, these are all part of the basket of things which are now labeled in the basket of social emotional learning. So we are trying to introduce that. Hopefully we will succeed. And what I would like to suggest is this, in this brief presentation, which I'm going to end in a minute, is to discuss the possibilities of unpacking SCL.
SCL-ஐ பிரித்தெடுத்து ஆசிரியர்களும் கல்வியாளர்களும் அதனோடு இணங்கி ஒரு பரீட்சிப்பு பாடத்தை முறை இல்லாமல் ஆனால் பாடவிதானத்துக்கு உட்பட்டு
into whatever subject they are teaching, so that it becomes non-stressful. Yeah, so that's all for the moment. So just, I'll be really glad to answer any questions on my presentation and anything else connected to what I said at the end of the others' presentations. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tara. Yes, I think that we may, yes, there are questions on this theoretical aspects, but and also some of the practice. But I think we'll just go to the other two panelists, and Sonam, you are right. Royal Academy of Bhutan, you are right there in the action. So if you can tell us something about that or whatever you want to share with us today, please unmute yourself and start your presentation.
Thank you, Sujata, and Dr. Tara and Dr. Ajanta for setting the standards very high for this discussion. I hope I'm able to do justice, Sujata. I've been asked to give an overview of the implementation and assessment of the emotional learning, social emotional learning here at the Royal Academy in Bhutan. But I feel like if I am to do justice to being able to paint a better picture of what the Royal Academy is doing at the moment, I would like to take some time off and then give everyone here a brief introduction to what the Royal Academy is all about. It's the idea behind its inception, the vision, and what is it that we're doing here that not just looks at the rote learning or the kind of education system that Dr. Ajanta had spoke about in his presentation. So if I just talk about the inception of the Royal Academy, His Majesty, the King of Bhutan, Jigme Gesar Namgyal Wangchuk, he said that our nation's vision can only be fulfilled if the scope of our dreams and aspirations are matched by the reality of our commitment to nurturing our future citizens. And His Majesty the King and the kings before him has always recognized and associated our country's remarkable journey of modernization and development to our education system. Thus, with the same belief and value placed on education, His Majesty established the Royal Academy. So the Royal Academy consists of the school, the Education Research Center, and the Teacher Development Center. And these three entities, they work on the creation of a learning process that we are calling the Bhutan Baccalaureate. It is a system of education that strives to help learners actualize their potential across the 5 areas of development. So, although today we are just discussing the social and emotional, when we look at holistic education here, we look at it through the lens of the 5 areas of development. So, on top of social, emotional, we also have physical, cerebral, and the spiritual. So, our understanding of a holistic education is one that helps learners actualize their potentials in all the 5 areas of development. The Education Research Center works on the philosophy and the learning process of the Bhutan Baccalaureate. And the Teacher Development Center helps understand the learning process and take it into the lives of the students. The school at the Royal Academy is the one that actually implements the learning process, which is contextualized to the school here in Bhutan, and it's located in Paro. All the while, these three centers, they work in synergy in order to constantly evolve the learning process, and not just evolve, but to continuously contextualize it to the learners as well as the teachers and the faculty members that we have here. So for us, this evolutionary mindset and the process is a necessary part of learning, for we believe that a learning that is solely focused on acquiring knowledge becomes obsolete with change in time and circumstances. Therefore, a holistic education system should be one that enables learners with the necessary skills, the necessary processes and watermarks, which will allow them to keep up with the demands and needs of the changing time. And more importantly, learn how to learn so that they're able to become lifelong learners. The vision of the Academy is based on the concept of a just and harmonious society. His Majesty, back in 2015, he spoke about how the aspiration of the country is to create and build a just and harmonious society. And the concept of a just and harmonious society is what inspires the Bhutan Baccalaureate learning process. Therefore, the entire learning process helps actualize the learners actualize their potential so that they become constructive and contributory citizens that will work towards the creation of the just and harmonious society. So talking about the 5 areas of development, although I'm just going to focus on two, which is the social and emotional for this webinar, I'd just like to bring your attention that these 5 areas of development are interconnected and therefore becomes imperative to be looked at as parts that needs equal attention, development and growth for a person to emerge as wholesome. The interconnectedness between social and emotional area of development is that emotional looks at the relationship, a relationship with self. If you look at, we have an internal world inside a community that is made up of emotions and feelings and thoughts, and it's also about learning to navigate through the internal environment that one has, while the social area of development is all about looking at your connection with the people around you, the physical environment, and learning to use that external physical environment to engage, to learn, and to just grow. And these two worlds, these two communities, the internal and the external, they are constantly influencing each other. And therefore, the ability for an individual to build a trusting relationship not just with the community outside, but with the community inside, becomes the crux of social emotional learning here at the Academy. And in order to create a trusting relationship, a learner has to be able to, first of all, look at certain skills like being able to uh, be more mindful and develop awareness so that we are able to look at our own strengths, the areas that needs development, and just define what success is for ourselves in terms of thinking about the goals that you want to achieve in terms of your emotional development as well as your social development. So and all of these different aspects of an interaction with yourself and your outer world finds place in what we call the roadmap, which includes all the 5 areas of development. So everyone here at the Royal Academy is considered a learner. We have young learners and adult learners like myself. And every year we create what we call the roadmap at the beginning of the year. And this is important because the ownership of the learning is with the individual. We think about what is it that we want to learn, why is it important for the individual. We look at how do you want to learn it and what is the timeline that you're giving yourself in order to become better. So those are the things that become part of the roadmap. The first aspect in the creation of a roadmap is looking at your backstory. Where do you come from? The kind of experiences that you have, the kind of challenges that you have come across, the circumstances that you grew up in. So that is what we call the pre-knowledge. And examples of pre-knowledge in the social and emotional learning could be our mindset, our attitude towards circumstances, towards experiences, towards people, even towards ourselves. Like, how do you view yourself? And more importantly, our perspectives on different concepts. I think Dr. Ajanta spoke about different events that are happening around the world that brings about important concepts and people's perspectives, like on whether it's on racism, whether it's on education, whether it's on poverty, and things like that. And more importantly, we also look at how is it that we interact with ourselves as well as the world around us. Then through the backstory, we identify our areas of strength, and we also identify the areas that we need to work on. And this is important because we use our strengths in order to lift the other people in our lives, as well as make an attempt to lift our community. So it's not about one's own growth in isolation from the others as well as from the community that you are a part of. And for that, we look at certain skills that you need, emotional skills, social skills. And some examples of these skills could be your ability to become aware of your social environment, your emotions, your feelings, being able to recognize what is it that you're feeling, how, where, what emotion are you experiencing, and more importantly, being able to develop a certain set of emotional and social vocabulary so that articulation becomes much more easier and much more efficient, because communication, just like trust is important for relationships, I think communication is also important, whether it's relationship with yourself or relationship with others. And the roadmap also plays a very fundamental role in terms of looking at assessment when it comes to social emotional learning. And here at the Royal Academy, assessment is very important because we look at it as the engine that drives the entire learning process, which is the continuous evolutionary process. And therefore, the assessment becomes part of a very big part of the learners here. And assessment here is done in the absence of numbers and grades. And I would like to go back to Dr. Ananta saying that you cannot use the same indicators to assess something different. Here the understanding is if you reduce the growth, the dynamic growth and the evolutionary development of an individual, if you reduce it to numbers and grades, we're just trying to quantify, and it will not be as effective, as efficient, or even as dynamic as our own growth. So what we try and do is the assessment here is basically anecdotal, and it gives richer perspectives because it includes the inputs of the learners themselves through the self-assessment. So for me, I know what is it that I'm experiencing, what is important to me, what am I trying to achieve, and how am I trying to achieve it, whether it's my own emotional goals or social goals. I look at my roadmap and I always assess myself based on my roadmap. Where am I right now? Where is it that I want to go? And at the same time, I also receive inputs from my peers. And it's the same for the young learners also. They do a lot of self-reflection and introspection of where they are in terms of their roadmap. They receive inputs from their peers, from the other teachers, but more importantly, they receive inputs from the mentor teacher. And the mentor teacher has a very special kind of relationship and connection with the learners. And even adult learners like us, we go through the mentorship program where we work with other teachers. So through the anecdotal assessment, we are able to notice our strengths again, which we then use to raise our bar and to continuously grow. And at the same time, help others in the learning journey as well. Through it, we're also able to identify our areas that needs further development. So that becomes, again, part of our roadmap going forward. And the most interesting thing is the assessment comes through various perspectives, not just our own, and it gives a much more uh, richer picture of our own growth and development. But more importantly, I think it enhances the sense of ownership and responsibility of the learning journey. And that sense of responsibility and ownership is with the learners themselves. So, and it is also done in a manner which is holistic and comprehensive. Then we use the comprehensive assessment to further enhance and review and then recreate our roadmap in our own learning journey. The assessment and the feedback loop is important because it closes but does not end the circle of the learning process, which is involved in the creation, the implementation, and the benchmarking of our own growth based on the roadmap. So through the implementation and the assessment of the social and emotional learning, along with the along with the other areas of development, such as cerebral, physical, and spiritual, the ultimate goal for social emotional learning is to create that harmonious relationship between our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions and our speech, so that we in turn develop the skills to be a constructive and contributory member of our community. And when we talk about a community, it's both the internal community as well as the external community. So this is where I'll end. I look forward to more questions later. Thank you.
Wonderful, Sonam. Thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I have lots. Next is Matthew McGregor-Stubbs. And Matthew, I was hoping you have experience in Sustainable Development Goals development and also on international assessment. Maybe you can bring us a more global perspective or anything else you'd like to share. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Could I check that you can all see my screen?
Yes, yes, we
Wonderful.
can see.
So yeah, so as Sujata alluded to, I've been doing some work with a team of colleagues at NFER over the last year, looking at particular aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals obviously provide the overall architecture for the type of progress that we're trying to make as a global society. And I'll be looking at this particularly talking about socio-emotional learning and particularly Sustainable Development Goal 4.7. I think one of the things that I think we've all come to realize over the past 12 months with the impact of COVID is the importance of, as we've all been saying today, growing young people as individuals, as holistic individuals that develop all sorts of skills such as resilience, determination, empathy, reflectiveness, and the ability to weather the sorts of changes that we are increasingly going through as a global society. So, Sustainable Development Goal 4.7 is all about progress in the provision of a broader education beyond literacy and numeracy and other core subjects. Really, it underpins the other Sustainable Development Goals because by addressing the themes within this target, we achieve progress across all of the different Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's also very interesting when we think about the different Sustainable Development Goals within education. There's a particular focus on Sustainable Development Goal 4.1, which focuses on the development of literacy and numeracy, which speaks to some of the points that were being made earlier, questioning whether we have the right balance in terms of our emphasis and where we put our efforts as educators. So target 4.7 stipulates that all learners need to acquire knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development, including, among other things, education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity, and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. So within that, there's a clear focus on global citizenship, education for sustainable development, but also a recognition of the importance of socio-emotional skills within that. I think it's also worth noting that of the SDG targets, 4.7.1, which focuses on the extent to which global citizenship education for sustainable development are mainstreamed in international education policies, curricula, teacher education, and student assessment. This is one of the goals on which we have the least amount of information. It's one of the goals which we struggle to monitor, which we struggle to assess the progress that we're making on. And when we have attempted to do it, we focused mainly on the knowledge side of things rather than on the other aspects of this goal. So the particular piece of work that I undertook with a group of my colleagues was to look at whether we could reframe this slightly, whether we could look at other sources of information in order to get a better picture of how we were progressing. So I mentioned just now that we focused primarily on cognitive, on knowledge. So the knowledge, the understanding, critical thinking and problem solving aspects about things like issues of citizenship and sustainable development. We've rather neglected the socio-emotional aspects and the behavioral aspects because they are more difficult for us to measure. So most of our measurement of activities have focused on the cognitive domain. So in recent cycles, we've seen in, for example, some of the large-scale international assessments, a focus on things like global citizenship or global competence, but these have really been tackling knowledge of global citizenship rather than the extent to which people practice global citizenship, the extent to which they're emotionally prepared for global citizenship. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, recently in the Southeast Asia Primary Learning Metrics Assessment, there was a focus on global citizenship and global competence. So it's important for us to recognize that there are all three domains within socio-emotional learning. When we move to thinking about curricula, again, we tend to focus on the cognitive aspects because it's what we feel comfortable with. It's how we can easily translate these aspects into our teaching, into our educating practices, into our educational policies. When we think about curriculum, we have different levels of our education systems, and we have different levels of curriculum. At the system level, you have what's intended, or what we term the intended environment, which is the national view of what our educational environment should be and the experience which students have within that system. Arguably at the school level, we have a planned environment. So what our school's desired vision of education is and how that should be implemented. We also have the implemented environment in terms of what actually happens within a school and what actually happens within a classroom. So how do people teach? How do teachers engage with their students? What are the pedagogical practices that they put into place? We have within the classroom the experienced environment, which is what a student actually experiences in their day-to-day learning. So the opportunities that they're given to engage with learning, either through their teacher-student interactions or their peer-to-peer interactions within the classroom. And finally, we have internalized learning, which is arguably where most of our assessment and measurement efforts have gone, which is focusing on what have students learned? What are they able to do? And again, this is focusing primarily, arguably, on the cognitive side of things. So if we think about this within socio-emotional learning, we can see some of the different elements that we are considering and that we might want to consider when trying to sense whether we are helping children to develop their socio-emotional learning, to develop as more holistic learners. And importantly, we also need to see an alignment within those different levels. Often what we know happens is that at a system level, a policy may be expressed that might support the development of socio-emotional learning. However, what may not then happen is that may not, for various different reasons, translate into what happens at the school level and what happens at the classroom level, perhaps due to different forces, different pressures. It may be because of the pressure put on teachers in terms of the accountability structures that are in place to ensure that their students are getting good grades. It could be pressures at the school level in terms of budgets and the amount of resource which school leaders have to dedicate to some of the different elements. So we wanted to look at how we created these opportunities. So we looked for evidence of what we termed a breadth of skills. So the different socio-emotional skills that we might want to be developing. So could we find evidence of these within the intended environment at the policy level? Could we find evidence of these skills in the planned environment at the school level? And could we find evidence of these skills in the implemented or experienced environment? And I think what's important here to stress is that we were not looking at the internalized, we were not looking at the actual cognitive or socio-emotional or behavioral attainment. We were more focusing on things that we felt could be indicative of creating the opportunities for the development of a holistic learning experience. So based upon that, we were able to draw together a conceptual framework, looking at these different levels, looking for sources of information where we might find the indicators. So for example, at the system level, it could be embedded in national education policies and education sector plans and budgets. At the school level, in terms of school policies, the way in which academic activities are organized and school budgets and how school performance management is enacted. Drilling down further in towards the classroom, looking at lesson plans, schemes of work, evidence of wider school activities which would promote the sorts of learning and the sorts of learning opportunities. In terms of the experienced environment, looking at the specific pedagogical practices that teachers were using to foster development. So was there a focus, as Ananta was talking about earlier, on rote memorization, or was there a focus on peer-to-peer interaction, on self-assessment, on assessment for learning, and not looking simply at the results of assessments and not looking just at test outputs and test results. So by working through this process and looking at different data sources, we were able to identify a series of indicators which were not exhaustive, they're not comprehensive, they don't cover everything, but they do provide what we feel is a pragmatic view of the extent to which an education system can create these opportunities to become and provide the sorts of learning opportunities that are required to develop socio-emotional skills. So looking at 3 thematic aspects, we were able to look at teaching and learning, identifying indicators relating to the vision, curriculum, pedagogies, teacher training, policies and materials that support the development of skills at the system, school and classroom level. Assessment and accountability, acknowledging the importance within education systems of assessment. We often hear that what gets assessed is what gets taught, and the washback effect from assessment and accountability. So looking at school accountability arrangements, student assessments for monitoring and supporting the development of a breadth of skills. And then finally looking at the broader enabling environments, so institutional arrangements, facilities, budget, policies and practices which support a positive learning environment and which support school engagement with the broader community. And through this, we were able to triangulate and identify at different points the extent to which alignment was occurring from the system level, so at policy, through to the school management level, but also down into the classroom. So this is a work which is still in progress, but it's, we feel, a very interesting development in terms of looking and considering the potential to have data and to monitor this particular sustainable development goal. That's the end of my presentation. I'd be very interested to answer any questions that anyone has. I've focused more on the conceptual side rather than the measurement side. I hope that's okay.
Thank you, Matthew. That really sort of brought it to a good place, looking at the global level and what you're doing with the Sustainable Development Goals. Before we go to the discussion, I first have to apologize to people who are listening in on interpretation. There was some disturbance at the beginning. We will make those slides available with translation later on our website, particularly Ananda's and Tara's slides. And during the discussion, I'm sure you will be able to hear them again in different forms. Before I go to the discussion, I'd like to actually ask Kavinda Tennakon, who's joining us to co-moderate here, but she's our member of our advisory board, but she's also founder of Tilly, which I think she can tell you herself. Kavinda, could you take a few minutes to talk about what you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me take less than like 2 minutes just to, I'll throw in the website so that anybody interested can check it out. And I think we probably have the research paper linked as well. So in a gist, this was a research project that started at the Stanford School of Education that kind of moved out of the university a few months ago. So our big North Star was figuring out how we can take empathy, critical thinking, and metacognition as kind of our 3 core skills for 5 to 10-year-olds with a North Star around teaching kids to be safe and healthy. So that was sort of the big aim. But what we were trying to do was to use game-based learning. So it was very exciting to hear what Dr. Anand had to say about it. Using game-based learning techniques to teach kids empathy and critical thinking. So how we do that is we use a storytelling approach, And kids kind of go through these set of characters. They learn some core skills. For example, if they're learning about trust, they learn a few tools like the trust circle, kind of for questions that they can ask themselves before trusting somebody. And then they go through this sort of a storytelling game where they help the character figure out who they can trust and not trust. So there we teach them kind of nuances around how trust is fluid, things about gut feeling, things around space and trust. So we use these very subtle stories to drive home these points. And what we have been testing is we use voice recognition and an AI model to actually measure the learning. But the child doesn't think of it as measured learning. So the child is not trying to collect points or kind of chase behind a score. So that the testing really happens on the back end, so that the parent and the teacher is able to see the child's kind of the cognitive growth, where they might be lacking. So we've been trying to test with that. So we've tested with around 250 learners so far, and the results have been phenomenal. So that's what we've been doing so far with Tilly. So we work with mainly 5 to 10-year-olds. So that's a bit about trying to balance personalized learning as well as the need to measure, because without measuring, it's a little hard to see if learning is happening. But we're trying to think of measuring in not the standard way of a score, but rather to gauge learning in terms of treating a child as one individual learner. Yeah, so that's a bit about what we're doing.
Thank you, Kavinda. Yes, I think I'm not. Right. So I think for the discussion, we'll be looking at the Kavinda and I will be looking at the chat and picking out questions. But I thought while we do that, we will ask the panelists actually whether they have questions for each other to clarify. So I will start with Anand. Anand, if you have any questions for one or more panelists, please go ahead. Anand, yes.
Yeah. Actually, one that I was intrigued with was with Matthew's presentation, especially with the struggle with SDG 4.7 indicators. And you had that table where one of those indicators was that you were looking at is like the number of policies and what has been enacted and stuff. We did a review a couple of years ago, and actually what we found was that there was a disconnect between policies that have been implemented. So a lot of countries, when they report that they have done it because of policies that they have. But in reality, on the ground, nothing has been done. So when we go and actually go to the schools and actually see implementation, it's far from where one would have expected. So there's this disconnect between the two. I'm wondering, how have you seen much of this, and are you focusing in a particular region in the world, or you're cutting across all the countries and so forth and so on? It's an extremely difficult exercise. So I take my hats off to your team to try even to bring some sense into 4.7. I always called it as the residue of an equation where they didn't know where to put all these things. So they added a residue to the equation and dumped everything that they couldn't into that 4.7. You have peace education, global citizenship education, ESD in there, everything that one can find that has been developed over the years, which doesn't fall under the main category of numeracy and literacy, was put under this 4.7. So trying to find an indicator seems to be a humongous task. So.
Yeah. So
Mentee,
yeah, I completely agree with you. It is a very challenging area, not least because whereas for things like literacy and numeracy, we have clearly established standards and ways of approaching measurement. And as you say, that there has been a history of attempts to look at this area where there is a disconnect between what happens within a policy level and what potentially is happening actually at the classroom level. So one of the things that we tried to do, so the approach was based around the use of surveys, so surveying and asking for documentary evidence at the different levels. So talking to people at a policy level, but then getting responses also from school leaders and from teachers, and then trying to triangulate that data and see the extent of the alignment and the extent to which things are working in harmony or working at cross purposes. So at the moment, it's very much on a small scale pilot basis, but it's something that we're hoping to develop further in partnership with UNESCO Institute for Statistics.
Thank you, Matthew. Tara, do you have any questions for others? A question for any one of the panelists?
Actually, it's a question that I'm just throwing open to all the panelists. Whether there have been elements of social-emotional learning, any of those traits that we discussed, the factor like empathy or critical inquiry, self-control, and so on, whether any one of those was specifically tested in a classroom setting in any of the countries you all have been working with, not just mindfulness per se, but the basket of values that we spoke of. And if so, were there any results that you could share with us in terms of learning outcomes and the levels of tensions and stresses that kids go through in overloaded curricular settings?
I would actually put that question to Sonam. I think she talked about the roadmap, and I'd like to know, what does a report card look like in that school? I mean, Sonam, do you think you can answer Tara's question?
So I think I'll start with your question, and maybe in an attempt to answer your question, Tara's question also gets answered. So you were asking, what does a report card look like? And I'll start off by the frequency of reporting back to the parents. We have 4 different reports going home. 2 are basically progress letters. And the progress letter is explaining about the different learning terms that we have here and what happens in each of these terms. So we start off by looking at the backstory, the collection of the backstory, the collection of the baseline. So the baseline and the backstory gives you an idea of where you are as an individual or where you are as a learner. So that's get reported back to the parents, seeing that, oh, your child is here in the 5 areas of development, your child is here in terms of English, your child is here in terms of maths. And these are all anecdotal reports coming in from the mentor and the different subject teachers. We have 2 comprehensive reports that goes home. Again, sometime in June, we sent one, and sometime towards the end of December, we sent another. So those are very comprehensive report that looks at the child's learning journey over the year. So the one that goes home in June looks at the growth of a child starting from when he came in, and that is most probably most of the time the academic year starts in February. But this year it was a little different because of the situation that COVID has created for all of us. We're not able to really wrap up the academic session for 2020 as of now, and even waiting for our some of our students to come back to school. So the fine line between the 2 years, 2020 and 2021, it's very blurry at the moment. But on a normal year, we would send home one in June and one in December. And the December report is very comprehensive because it looks at the child's progress and growth over a year, starting from February all the way to December. And it includes a lot of information from the child's roadmap, the kind of experiences that he had on campus. And these experiences not just include the experiences on campus, the experiences that the child has had working with the members of the community, which is outside the school campus, uh, working with the natural environment that we have access to at the moment. We are located right on top of a mountain and surrounded by forest. So you can imagine the kind of experiences that the children would have, especially for people who come in from the southern plains who do not have the same kind of environment. So for them, it's a completely new experience. So those are the things that makes up the report rather than grades and numbers.
Yeah. Thank you, Sonam. We have a question from the audience. It's actually from Sanuja Gunatilaka, who's a researcher with us. Is there bias in teachers? How do you account for that? And I have my own question. How would a principal say no, that you are doing, your children are emotionally in these 5 dimensions that they are progressing? Is there some way for the principal or the benefactor, the king, to know how this school is progressing? Mm-hmm. So the first thing is bias in teachers. How does that come into?
I think when it comes to reports like ours, which is purely based on observations, whether you're observing yourself, whether it's someone else observing you, there will be certain biases coming in. And that is why I said that it's really important to understand your backstory, because your backstory actually gives you a better understanding of the biases that you already have and how that comes into play when you're making those observations, whether in yourself or in your learners, as well as your peers. So the backstory and the study of the backstory gives you an understanding of that bias. And it would be wrong for me to say that we have removed all biases from the reporting system. I think somehow the other certain elements of biases will come into play. But like I said, it is not just one individual's perspective that is coming through. So if I say that I'm making exceptional progress, but if my peer thinks otherwise, I'll have to reflect on this. How is it that there is two different narratives about my own growth? And that is further on enhanced by a teacher that says, oh yes, you are making exceptional progress, but these are certain elements that you need to focus on. So it's also about being able to compare the kind of inputs that are coming in and go through that reflective process together with your mentor teacher. So that is why I'm saying the mentor teacher actually has a very special connection, because the mentor is supposed to be almost like a parent on campus. So you spend over 10 months with this individual, and some of the kids that we have here in current grade 12 are the ones that has been with us for the last 6 years. So the kind of understanding, the kind of progress, the kind of changes that we are able to notice and see in our student is of a completely different level. And I think the system that we have in place allows us to gain that deeper understanding of the kind of progress that we are able to see in our children.
Just that question about the principal, how does a principal or somebody, you would know, you are the emotional development coordinator. How do you know the teachers are doing well?
Yeah. So when it comes to the principal, we don't really have the principal. The entire functioning or the running of the school is done by the 5 coordinators. We do have a director, and the director is basically the one that drives you towards that vision of the creation of a just and harmonious society. And it is the 5 coordinators who, the idea is that of a shared leadership. So for a week, I am on duty, and how I run the school, how I function is completely different from the next coordinator who's going to run the school for the next week. So every week there is a different dynamic that is brought in by different leaderships by the coordinators. And it's the same with the timetable also. We don't have a fixed timetable, but there are certain non-negotiables on the timetable. And one of those non-negotiable is that 20 minutes quiet time in the morning, where the children and the teachers are just left on their own. And it is up to you what you do with the 20 minutes. But the idea is you have to be on your own. You have to look at your thoughts. You have to set the intention for the day. And how you do it is entirely up to individuals. So those are just examples of certain non-negotiables on the timetable. And when it comes to the principal, like I said, we don't have one, it's just the 5 coordinators. And within the 5 coordinators, our own understandings of the 5 areas of development constantly evolve based on our interaction with our learners, new information, new circumstances. For example, last year, I think our focus had to shift from the plans in the beginning of the year. And the majority of the students as well as teachers identified under emotional development that one area that they would like to focus on is how do you overcome distractions? Because learning was moved online. And when you move online, there are so many distractions online. And even I was telling my children that it's very difficult to stay focused on what you're doing online, because you see a pop-up and then says, oh, it's your friend's birthday, or somebody has dropped a hi, and it's very difficult for you not to respond to those distractions. So a new learning for all of us last year was being able to overcome distractions. And in that, we're all working together, trying to identify what are those distractors and how do you reduce our interaction with those distractors. So it's very much a learning journey for the teachers as well as the students.
Thank you, Sonam. Do you have any questions for the panelists?
I think I'll just ask, maybe it could be a clarification or it could be a question for Matthew.
Sure.
In your slide, there is a line that says, what gets assessed gets tested. So I'm thinking like education or research organization. So do you see any changes in the kind of assessment that is happening, because the way we are looking at education is evolving? And now we're seeing, oh, we need to move out or move away from just mere memorization of content and knowledge, and we need to look at the social and the emotional. So if we are shifting our focus on other areas, we need to look at how do we make sure that the assessment is comprehensive enough to include that change. Similarly, for children who are graduating out of schools and institutes, how do you make sure that that change in assessment is also becoming a part of the assessment that the college boards do for the children? So are the college boards looking at just grades and scores and marks and looking at how well you did in terms of memorizing a textbook, or working with numbers or coding and things like that? Or do we have a space for bringing on those anecdotal reports where you're looking at the admission of a student not just based on the numbers that he's bringing in, but the qualities that he brings in as a member of a community, the qualities that he brings in as a good human being, a global citizen? So what are the possibilities of having that shift from the grades and numbers to that bigger picture of an individual's growth?
Thank you for the question. I will do my best to answer it, although I may struggle to answer kind of all of the different elements. I think, first of all, we do have an issue with washback in many countries. So that's the extent to which an assessment informs the teaching that happens So we speak often about teaching to the test. So we teach the specifics of what a student needs to pass a particular exam. And that can manifest itself in a very narrow curriculum. So the curriculum which the student experiences during their school life may actually be much narrower than is intended, because their teachers feel under pressure to prepare them for examinations, and so they focus on particular areas or content areas or subjects which they know are going to be tested. And I think that's a challenge that we have. It's something which people are aware of. We try to mitigate. I think in many countries there's been a move away from assessment simply of knowledge towards more assessment of skills and how you apply that knowledge, which I think is a very positive move. But the worry, if we start to assess socio-emotional learning, is that we will fall into the same traps. We will suffer in the same way, that we will be focusing almost superficially on whether people can demonstrate these skills. And that's also another question, is simply demonstrating something doesn't necessarily mean that they are applying that regularly in their day-to-day life as well. So that's, I think, another thing which we need to think about as a global group of educators is, how do we measure socio-emotional learning? Some elements of which are easier to measure than others. Do we want to measure them in the same way as we've traditionally measured academic excellence? And then with regards to your question around how do college boards manage this, I think it's, so I'm not particularly familiar with college admissions, but I am aware that they do attempt in many countries to supplement the academic achievement tests or examinations with portfolios, for example, of work, or with personal essays which give an individual an opportunity to express themselves as a more holistic, rounded person beyond just the simple grades that they've achieved.
Thank you, Mentee. I think I will. I'll ask one question, and then I will ask Kavindya. Also, I hope she'll be scanning the chat while I speak. My question is to actually Anand and Tara. When I posted this on tweet, somebody said, there's nature and nurture, and our DNA brings some things. And I think if I understand correct, what you describe is nurture, but how much of nature can we change? There are some people who are a little more aggressive, some people who are a little more laid back. And are we looking for, there should be some variation to make life more interesting also. This kind of individual you'll think of, even the mindful person, how much variation are we going to see that? And is that a baseline? I don't know whether I'm asking the right question, but this nature versus nurture. The example they use is dandelions versus orchids. There are certain people who need more who are like wild weeds. They flourish in any situation. Then there are these orchids. And also there are these people who are more aggressive. And it works for them. They don't hurt, others. And there are some who are laid back. Are we looking for some sort of uniformity, or how does this work? Anand and then Tara.
I'm a little bit apprehensive if we sort of say that some of us are a little bit more aggressive by nature. I think it's always the system that tends to bring that out among us. I would like to believe what many neuroscientists have, what's his name, R.C. Ramachandran, in the sense that, we are born, we are neurowired to be empathetic. And they have found this quite evident among babies. And then you sort of see a shift at a certain age where there was a classic paper, I think it was, I'm not sure where, I think it was published in Science, where they found that at a certain age, a child is able to respond to an external stimuli based on an understanding of what that external stimuli expects of the child's response. And that happens in the age of 18 or 24. I'm not sure of the specifics. So, and that I think comes from the system rather than from the fact that one was born in that way. So, of course, you have a small group. I think they tend to say psychopaths are born. In a sense, they are wired in a very different way from birth. But I think for the majority, and I don't know, I'm not a neuroscientist, but kind of reading up on it's a fascinating study that has kind of kept me engrossed for the last few years. And in Robert Sapolsky's book on Behave, talks about that evolution process that has brought us from the very early days of the evolution of the human brain over time. So I would sort of say that it's that, you know, we are all born or rather neurobiologically wired for empathy. And that is what I see as a saving grace for humanity as a race. The problem is that I think, as a species, have been so intelligent that we have developed a system that goes against our very nature. And I'll leave it as that for some people to mull over.
Okay, thank you. Tara, do you have any comments on that?
And one more thing about the assessments. The one thing I learned about report cards is that I should not take up a profession as a professional forger. I could never forge my parents' signatures on the report cards when I brought it back. So I learned that I should not take that as a professional profession. That's the only thing I learned from report cards.
Okay. Tara, do you have any comments on that? On to my question?
It's like this. Yes, I agree that there are certain people with different personalities, like you quite rightly said. But I also agree with Anand in that we have this innate ability, everybody who is born with some form of wiring, if you could call it, for empathy, for kindness, for mindfulness, and so on. It's an innate practice that we can always bring out from within us, provided the mind is trained that way. So recent science has shown this to happen, but I'm going even further back, and there are documented stories, shall I say, which talk about people who have actually changed from being very, very aggressive and violent people, but whose minds have been made to reflect perhaps only on kindness, only on empathy, or only being mindful. Such people do change because like we discussed earlier, the brain and the neurons have the ability to change, which has been proved only in the last 20 or 30 years. But yes, that potential is there. Personalities wise, yes, a little tendency for aggression can be more, but very much the environment can contribute to that. But even in such people, the exposure to these positive emotions with repeated exposures to kindness and empathy and reflection, and making the mind tune into such positive emotions. And that's what His Holiness challenged the neuroscientists with. Just as much as you talk of depression and anxiety and so on, allowed the subjects to focus on the positives, and then they saw the result. So I think there's a lot of potential, and the work is still ongoing. So I think it's good news for all of us.
Thank you. I like to just post the same. Yeah, did somebody? Yeah, I like to post the same question to Sonam. In your school, how much variation do you see among children? And the second question is, yours is a very special school. What if you were to mainstream this into the Bhutan system? Will the teachers be prepared for that, and how much, how do you prepare the sort of on a large scale? Sonam?
Okay, so two questions, if I'm not wrong. First one is the variation. I think similar question asked to Dr. Ananta and Tara. Um, the belief here is that everyone is born with innate goodness, and that comes from the kind of religious belief, the Buddhist belief that we have very strongly as part of our culture and tradition here. So we like to look at individuals as someone born with innate goodness, and it is just the different nurturing, I guess, and the circumstances and the environment that you are raised in that brings in the various of individuals. So our effort here is to connect with that goodness, and it somehow ties into what Dr. Tara was saying about recreating those neuropaths, whether it's being able to discover that I do have the ability to be kind, even if I don't want to. If you're coming from a home where you did not have enough, the idea of sharing is completely unthinkable for a child who did not have enough growing. But like Dr. Tara said, there is hope for all of us. I think for the children, where it's easier to make that connection in their brain, they can actually learn how to be more kinder. They can actually learn how to be more compassionate and more empathetic. And these are goodness that can be relearned, even if you have forgotten in the process of growing up. And that's my thought on the first one. The second one is you are right in saying that whatever the learning process that we have, it is just part of this one school, which is the Royal Academy, which is one aspect of the Royal Academy. And this year we have started working with two of the schools that are under the Ministry of Education. So we have already started our process of taking our learning experiences. But it's not about, again, taking what fits for us and then saying, here, we have this, and then you can take it and use it. But it's about going through that process from the very beginning with the two schools, because we spoke about contextualizing it and making sure that the learning process is individualized for the learners of a different school, of a different community, from a different home. So for what works for us may not work for them. So right now our focus is just bringing the adults on board. And I feel like if you are able to bring the adults on board, the half the battle is won, because it's easier to work with children. They are very open to changes. They are very adaptable at the moment. It's just the adults that we're working with, and a fair amount of our interaction with the two new schools that we're working with will be spent on looking at the learning process as an individual growth, not as something that you will take directly to your students and the school, but using it to see yourself, look at your own growth and see whether it makes sense to you or not. So just when we think that we have the adults on board, then maybe we will be able to roll out in the other schools.
Thank you. Kavinda, do you want to ask a question or two?
Yeah, I think that was, I'll start with a question on the chat. There was one question, it was a question to Matthew about classroom observations, and if you are collecting any examples of pedagogy that promotes skills, behaviors, and values you seek, but without formal measurement.
Yes. So unfortunately, due to the impact of COVID, we weren't able to actually perform classroom observations, but we were able to put surveys out to teachers, which were intending to capture examples of pedagogical practices which would support the development of socio-emotional skills. So we looked at the literature, we looked at a number of different sources of information on teaching practices, including teaching standards, national curriculum, to identify what we felt were indicators of those positive pedagogical practices, and then asked for the students' responses, not students' responses, sorry, teachers' responses to enable us to identify those things.
There was also another question. I'm trying to sort of put different questions together of any best practices around involving parents in social emotional learning. Any case studies, best practices that you've seen that has worked well? Sonam, Matthew, Dr. Tara, to all of you.
Yeah, so can I make a comment on what Kavindya asked now? This
Please.
is it was a program we did with about 200 teachers from 3 districts in the Western Province to get together with the Ministry of Education. This was about 2 or 3 years ago. They were all primary school teachers who went through an 8-week program of mindfulness coupled with social emotional skills, or value education as we call it. And they all had issues connected to the classroom management because they were all very urban teachers. Their classrooms were generally full, something like 40 to 50 or 60 students. So it was very stressful. So after the 8-week program, we didn't do a formal study because we couldn't, because we were working with the ministry at that time. We just got some testimonials and collected some evidence from them and from some of the parents. And the responses were remarkable. We've actually posted it on the Mindful Educators website. Because if I may just summarize in a few minutes, all they said was these practices helped us to deal with our day-to-day problems better. We were able to manage the classroom better. We were able to be more kind to the students. Corporal punishment is a huge problem in Sri Lanka. Some of them even said the temptation to inflict abuse on children became much more manageable because we were aware of those temptations. So it was all in all very positive, and at the end of it, I regretted so much that we couldn't do a formal evaluation. So the testimonials from a group of teachers from Colombo, Kalutara, and Gampaha, there were the 3 districts from urban schools, about 200 of them. It was very, very positive. And we plan to do a similar thing, like I mentioned, with Arigato International, but on a larger scale. So that's the first thing. May I also take this opportunity to make a comment on what Sonam said and her school? I know personally at least 4 private schools in Sri Lanka that's adopting these practices because they are able to take their own decisions. Sadly, in the Sri Lankan education system, the decisions cannot be made by individual principals or individual schools, so it's top down. So these private schools, which are autonomous, they implement mindfulness with some of these values with excellent success, excellent progress. One is a very popular and a very high-end international school. The others are private schools. So not only do they introduce simple mindfulness practices at the beginning of the day, sometimes at the middle of the day, and sometimes at the end. Apart from that, they bring in the good positive emotions and the value systems we spoke of. I really don't know whether they have done an evaluation or an assessment. But all I'm trying to say is it's so easy when a school has the ability to take a decision on what to implement, the way Sonam is doing with her school, as opposed to trying to implement it mainstream on a large scale.
Thank you, Dr. Tara. I was wondering if any of the other panelists had any insights on kind of also getting parents involved or teachers for that matter.
At the moment, we do not have a lot of experience working with parents because, like I said, the students that attend the Royal Academy come from 20 districts, and although Bhutan may be very small, but due to the geographical features, just getting from one end of the country to the other end takes about 3-4 days. And during the monsoon, it gets even worse. So getting the parents involved especially for the children who are coming from far-flung villages, is very difficult. And also the other fact is the kind of students that we have at the moment. Some are orphans, some are from the single parent household. So and some are just busy. They do not have that finance, or in terms of financially, they're not able to make it to the school to discuss about this, because just making earning a livelihood is more important for them at the moment. So far we haven't really worked with the parents, and just including the parents of the children who can make it, who are available, would not be fair, in the sense that the kind of inputs, the kind of feedback, or the kind of work that we are able to do with them would not be as comprehensive as we want to. So for the moment, we have left the parents, because like I said, the students are on campus with the teachers for 10 months every year. So we are practically their parents. And I think when it comes to working with teachers in terms of the social and emotional learning, and not just in these two areas, but the other areas of development also, everyone is on board. Everyone is, we have what we call the mentor-mentee meeting, which is one of the non-negotiables. So every week you sit with your mentees, and usually a teacher would have a minimum of 10 at the moment, and it might go up to 15 depending on the number of students that we bring in every year. But we are capping at 15, so that that interaction remains efficient. So every Saturday we sit with our mentees, we talk about how the week was, where they are in terms of their roadmap, what is it that they think that they were successful in, and also thinking about what are some of the challenges. And we also talk about how do you overcome those challenges. Do you need support from each other? Do you need support from adults? Or do you think this is something that you as a learner can overcome on your own, and you just need more time? So those are the things that becomes a part of the mentor-mentee meeting. It's just about open communication. It's just about listening to the children, and it's also allowing them that space, as well as that respect that they deserve in terms of sharing and then talking about their own growth and progress.
Thank you, Sonam.
Avinda, you can ask your own questions.
Yeah, I had sort of a quick comment to that, and kind of a last question that I wanted to ask. I think a comment on the parents' involvement is, I totally agree, because in terms of Tilly is really geared towards children from at-risk communities and families. So parents honestly don't care. They have so many other problems to think about besides sitting down and having a conversation with their child about their feelings. And that's the reality we're dealing with. And one of the things that we did was we tested with about 220 learners and 56 parents. We gave them this kind of a storytelling pack. So there were like 4 learning cards and then 13 stories, short stories that helped build a conversation between the parent and the child. So they will sit through and they will go through each card. It was very quick. It was like 30 minutes. And they would ask really deep questions around safe spaces, around touch, and things like that. And around 80% of parents said that this is the first time they spoke about anything besides something logistical with their child. So that was the first time they had a non-logistical conversation. I think that was just something that sort of worked well for us. I think my question is, with social emotional learning, I think right now, most of the schools, at least in the global south, have extremely large classroom sizes. We're dealing with a lot of financial issues, children who are malnourished, below the poverty line, and they can't be left behind. But at the same time, social emotional learning is not like a one size fits all thing, as Sonam said. So I honestly don't have an answer to this, but it's kind of how do we make high quality social emotional learning accessible to schools like this, children who are not going to a very safe and comfortable home. What kind of solutions and case studies or ways of thinking do we have to address sort of the majority of children who might maybe never have access to self-learning at any point in their lives? How are you thinking about it and making sense of it?
Can
Over
I
to
just
all
give an opinion?
Tara.
Yeah.
Tara, you have.
Like I said before coming there, I feel we need to unpack this term. The term is a little daunting, particularly for a Sri Lankan education system. When you say social emotional learning, I mean, people think, oh my gosh, just another subject piled upon an already heavy curriculum. You know, that's a kind of impression people don't know. So definitely these kinds of vulnerable communities, particularly those who are not safe at home, particularly those who have a kind of a natural culture of domestic violence, in addition to having disabilities, so many things. So my kind of heartfelt view is that it's got to be in tiny doses, but take small bits. I mean, a little bit of kindness. I mean, I would like if you all can have a look at Richard Davidson's team that put out this kindness curriculum together, which most of you would have seen it already. It talks of small bite-sized initiatives, which can be, you know, even shared with a turbulent home. It can be shared with a mother who is traumatized and distressed due to other reasons, or shared with the classroom. So that, coupled with simple mindfulness techniques, very, very simple, trying not to bring this big label of social emotional learning, but unpack it and gradually introduce it in different bits and pieces, because communities differ, countries differ, schools differ, as we all know. We all come from different parts of the world. So I think our teachers know exactly how to do it. If we can share this with our teachers, I'm sure they will do a wonderful job in taking this particular message to kids, whether they are disadvantaged or not, in different ways.
If I could add a few comments, I think from my perspective, it's about integrating it into the curriculum, and rather than having it as a standalone part of your curriculum, it should be part of something which happens on a daily basis within schools and within the classroom, which is through the opportunities for children to interact, to work together, to learn how to develop together and how to interact with each other. I would also add that I think you mentioned, Govinda, some of the most at-risk children. And I would argue that they are the children that most need the opportunities to develop socio-emotional skills, given the challenges and hardships which they face. And also the likelihood that, as you mentioned, they will not get those opportunities to develop these skills. So I do think, you know, we need to think increasingly about how we do that, particularly in emergency settings. I think a final point, which Tara alluded to, is the fact that we are different. We are culturally different. And I think this speaks back to a point that was being made earlier on around the nature versus nurture discussion. So how we think of things in our different cultures will shape the way in which individuals develop. There's a lot of work, if you look at the work done by Hofstadter on cultural differences across the big 5 factors of personality. So we have cultures which focus on individualism, like in the United States, versus those who are very collectively oriented. We have cultures which are more open to distances in power between leaders and followers, and others which are much more democratic. There are all these kinds of different cultural nuances, which will also impact on how we think about some of the elements of socio-emotional learning. so the civil lens through which we look at education is also important, I think.
Kavinda, I have a, thank you, Matthew. Kavinda, I have a comment to make. Kavinda, okay. Hi. Kavinda, I think I'll make a comment on some experience I've had in assessment. Kavinda, are you there?
Yes. Yes, Dr.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So what we did in a school in a remote area in Sri Lanka, we did an experiment on holistic learning. What we did is a very simple thing. We introduced a journal, which I think probably what Sonam refers as backstory, but it's every day they would write what they did in the classroom. These were primary children. And what we did is they maintained this journal, and there was another parent journal where the parent would write something about the child, and there were parents of varying levels, but they participated in this very enthusiastically. Most of them. This was done with the Provincial Education Authority, and what we did is, to assess what we did is, we collected randomly one journal from the 50 schools, from the 5 grades, so 250 journals. And we developed some criteria. We sat around and we went through the journals. We were not assessing the child. We were assessing the classroom environment. Has this classroom environment given them an opportunity to explore? Then you can tell that by looking at it from the whole school. We did it. They talk about going on the bunt of the what we call it, the lakes. We have lots of lakes in that area. How they go for walks and what they saw. They drew pictures, and the teachers comment on that. And so we actually gave a number on 3 dimensions, which was cognitive, social, and other one is personal. Whether the children have been given the opportunity to grow. So actually that was, it's just a very short paper. We published that, but I think this goes to what Matthew was talking about, assessing the environment, learning environment. I wonder whether, then I go to Matthew for a question, whether would you see that as a viable way of assessing the environment? And also, then I have a second question, which I will add to that. PISA PISA adds on the PISA test, the international test on PISA stands for something now I forget, but international test, they tagged on some questions sometimes. And once they tagged on questions about computer use, I wonder whether PISA would tag on some questions about, how they're learning in this social emotional skills, what kind of opportunities, whether you can do a environment assessment through PISA. Those are just 2 questions for Matthew, actually.
So I definitely think looking at the environment is a viable way of trying to get a sense of whether these skills are being promoted, because we know that unless certain things are put in place, the skills definitely won't be developed. So yes, I do think it's viable. In terms of your question around PISA, so generally with a lot of the international large-scale assessments, they will have background questionnaires which go to school leaders, teachers, but also on occasion students. And they do ask different questions around things like the home environment, the parents' background, socioeconomic status. So I think there may be increasingly interest in trying to use some of the more contextual information allied to the performance. So that's an area of growing interest. And I think a lot of educators around the world are increasingly becoming more and more aware of the importance of socio-emotional development. And we're seeing that being reflected in the sorts of policies that different governments in different countries are enacting as well.
Okay, thank you. Kamda, can you see any other questions?
Yeah, there's one more question. The question is around, is there any evidence of helping to achieve objectives of social emotional learning through aesthetic education? Presenting the Sri Lankan context, the aim is to give skills in arts, music, dancing, that kind of aesthetic subjects. There's no emphasis on teaching to appreciate good music, stories, etc. So really to see, is there a way to have aesthetic education integrated into social emotional learning?
Actually, my view is that the elements of social emotional skills should be integrated into every area. It's not a subject, it's not a separate speciality. It's how you deal with situations, with people, with peers, with different types of encounters. So it's nothing to do with this is the fear that people think this is yet another basket of subjects. It is not, it's just a kind of a skill set for behavior. And for durability, like I mentioned in my presentation, mindfulness is the core, otherwise it again becomes another lecture or a classroom input. But, to make it sustainable and durable on a foundation of mindfulness. So not just aesthetics, whether you're teaching science or environment or maths or physics, these should be integrated and it can be done. There are people who have tried it out, and I'm sure more and more people will try it out in the future. And I would really like to share information. And if people like Sonam and Matthew and Kavindya, you all have some kind of information on how these are integrated, not as subjects, not as specialities, but as behavioral disciplines or skills, it would be lovely to hear from you all, because that's what we need to promote and move away from this typical basket of subjects that students are usually made to go through in a traditional school setting.
Yeah, I think I'll just share our experiences here in terms of aesthetics. Although we are looking at aesthetics as a subject when it comes to teaching of music and dances and things like that, art and craft, but we're also going beyond looking at aesthetics as a subject. That is by looking at aesthetics as a mindset. Uh, and when you have that mindset, you're looking at everything and looking at the value that offers, whether it's an experience, whether it's a connection, whether it's an it could be an art form, it could be a piece of music. So the value that you derive or that you place on someone or something or some experiences. The other one is through the lens of aesthetics, we try and discuss and have discussions on concepts like beauty and truth. What does it mean for individuals? What does it mean for children? And how do you use those understandings to look at your relationship with yourself, with others, with the world around you? And it could also be looking at the beauty in a particular music from different cultures. Bhutan is small, but we are very diverse and very rich in terms of our culture and tradition. And even within a very small district, you can have 3 or 4 different languages come across. And all this individual beauty and value and truth that you have as part of an individual and as part of a community is something that the kids bring from home, and we call them the 7 gifts. And the 7 gifts that they bring to school is the gifts of recipe from your community, the gift of a song, the gift of dance, the gift of stories, the gift of the local language, the gift of a traditional indigenous game that we have never heard of. So the school is actually a place where the individuals can actually bring about all those differences, but still find beauty and value and truth in what you are able to share. And it also allows the learners to have a lot of sense of bigger ownership in terms of what is it that they're offering. And we're also looking at learners not just as somebody who's also always receiving, but learners as somebody who's actually going out there and exploring and discovering and bringing back to a community where everyone is willing to learn and receive what you have to share. And the other question was around how do you actually make sure that it becomes a part of a curriculum. And here it's quite the other way around. The subjects are centered or built upon, the curriculum is actually built on the 5 areas of development, which includes social and emotional learning. So that way it's very difficult to isolate English and just teach English and not focus on the social or the emotional aspect of the learners, of the teachers. And it's very difficult for us not to bring in those elements. So when you kind of like turn the table and instead of having a curriculum that includes the 5 areas, if you have the 5 areas as a foundation where you include the subjects as one way that we have been able to successfully implement the 5 areas of development. And the other concept that we look at is we do not really look at the 5 areas or the different subjects that we learn in school in silos. I've talked about the interconnectedness. So everything is connected. There is always some connections. And for us as teachers is to be able to find those connections and show it to the children so that they are able to do it on their own. So in the process of bringing back a gift from their community, the kind of cerebral skills that they have to use, they need to design interview questionnaires, they have to have certain social skills when they're going out into the community and interacting with the elders and asking them questions. They need to have some technical skills also, whether you're recording the conversation and writing a transcript, or whether you are videotaping that conversation and then trying to create a movie out of it and things like that. So everything comes together under through the lens of cross-pollination, and everything becomes connected. The people, the concepts, the skills, as well as the processes and the watermarks. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, this is the last 10 minutes, Kavinda. We usually do a wrap up, but I don't see a need for that. Maybe Kavinda could try one in the last 5 minutes. But I have we are getting to talk a lot, Sonam, but you come with hands-on experience. I'm wondering how you recruit teachers, and what kind of teacher guides do they get? How do the teachers learn these techniques?
So the recruitment process is quite rigorous, but when it comes to recruiting people, we don't really have a set criteria saying that, oh, we need a master's degree applicant, or we're looking for somebody who has experience in terms of teaching. The only thing that we are keeping an eye out is for an individual who's willing to learn, who's open-minded, and who has the rigor and the resilience to go through the process of learning and unlearning. Somebody who is not easily frustrated. And that is why when we look at the kind of composition of team that we have here, we have fresh graduates whose first job is here at the Royal Academy. And we also have experienced teachers. I have been teaching in government schools for the last 9 years. And on top of that, I have been with the Royal Academy for 7 years. So in my 15, 16 years of teaching and working with children, I see that if you have the ability to keep learning and allowing certain ownership and certain parts of your power as a teacher and then give it to the children, I think you're hired for the Royal Academy.
It's very much handpicked. Yeah.
Yes. And we
teacher guides.
When we onboard a new teacher, we take them through a process where they go through the 5 areas of development, just like a new student would. And we don't have teacher guides, we don't have textbooks. The only thing that we have is a collection of His Majesty's speeches, because that's through the speeches, what we have is we have trace to our history, where we come from. What are the strengths from our history? Uh, Current affairs, where are we now in terms of world economy? What is happening around the world, our current status, whether it's coping and responding to the pandemic, whether it's the kind of responses that we have for the education system during the pandemic and things like that. And we also have in place where we are going in terms of whether it's where we are going as a nation, where we are going as an individual. How do you contribute to the bigger vision? So that's the only thing that we have as part of our textbook. But other than that, we do not have textbooks for children. We do not have guidebooks for teachers. So that is because, like I said, everything needs to be contextualized. Whenever we have a new group of children, and we have the grades start from grade 7 all the way to 12, and every year the 12s pass out and the new group of 7s come in, and when they come in, they bring in a new dynamic, new backstories that will contextualize the entire learning process as well as the learning framework. So the only thing that is constant here is the concept of change. And we just need to be prepared, ready to respond and adjust and adapt to changes.
Yes. I have one more question, then I will give it over to Kavinda. Kavinda, if you don't mind, wrap up the session, give some summary of where we could go from here. I think my question was for Matthew, whether we are going through we're going to action research where we're working with the school zone. They have about, I think, 300 150 schools, and we are trying to develop indicators for the learning environment in the school. So are you in the process of in a experiment of that nature? And we like to, maybe we could participate, or maybe we could get some the elements or indicators. We're still in this business of indicators and assessments, not like in Bhutan. I think we still need to, as I said, what gets measured, or even the environment, maybe it's not the student. Is there something like that international assessment thing that we can participate? And I think for Sonam, I think I had another question. But you would have some learning outcomes, wouldn't you? That expected mathematics, they learn about circles, and then they learn about, the circumference and all that. Are there written down learning outcomes? So maybe I'll ask Sonam first, and then I'll ask Matthew. Sonam, are there learning outcomes, specified learning outcomes for the teachers?
So when I said we don't have textbooks, when we don't have teacher guides, the whole idea is what happens is the moment we have a textbook and a teacher's guide as teachers, we would not explore beyond what is there in the guide. And for students also, the exploration stops with the textbook. So the whole idea is to drive home that idea that learning is not limited to guide, learning is not limited to textbook. It's about being able to explore, it's being able to interact and discover from what is there in your community, and actually using your community as a resource to learn across the 5 areas of development through the idea of cross-pollination, learning how to connect what is it that you learn with real life challenges and circumstances and situations. And I think last year was just a testament to the kind of education that we have in place as learners, where you had to navigate on your own, away from schools, away from your teachers. So as learners, how equipped were you to be able to take your learning on your own, be self-regulated, be self-driven when it comes to your learning, is something we as teachers need to think about. Um, so that is why we are trying to move away from the use of textbooks and guidebooks. But that doesn't mean we don't have a direction in sense of where we want to go. So what we have is we have the national standards. So we use that national standards as the baseline for benchmarking ourselves, benchmarking our students' performance. And on top of the national standards, we have what we call the cross-pollination reviews, which includes the 5 areas of development as well as the subjects that you're learning. So it could be looking at a real life situation, but you're using your skills and the processes of learning and implementing and applying things that you have learned in the 5 areas of development, as well as bringing in a little bit of maths and we're looking at maths as a language also, a language of science and economics and things like that. So it's pretty exciting at the same time. It's pretty demanding because you have to make sure that you meet those standards and go beyond, which includes our own Bhutan Baccalaureate curriculum, centered around the 5 areas of development, the idea of cross-pollination. So we also learn our national language, which is called Dzongkha. So when you read a story in Dzongkha, maybe you will be asked to answer in English, and maybe you might be asked to connect it with something that you have learned in the life science classes, or maybe asking you to connect it with something that you have learned from your community. So it's just about allowing the children to really break free from that notion that learning happens within a class and learning happens through a textbook, as well as learning happens only in silos, just breaking all the barriers of the subjects and looking at concepts through the eyes of skills and processes. And in the process of looking at these concepts, you develop certain watermarks, and these watermarks could be lifelong values. And the biggest value that we are striving to achieve is to become lifelong learners, where you're always curious, where you're always inquisitive, and driving yourself to explore and continue learning on your own.
Thank you, Sonam. I'm just going to just thank everybody and then let Kavinda take over, and we'll stop sharply at 5. Just thank you so much, Sonam, Matthew, and Tara, and Avanti and Yuresha. Avanti Arsparatna, who's a researcher, Yuresha, who's everything, and for helping us in the back. And this is the first time we tied interpretation, and I think there were some glitches at the beginning, but I think it worked out. Please let us know later, and we will let you have the what you missed. We'll try to get it to you as much as possible. Kavinda, please, the last word is yours.
I think I'm not going to take much time, but I think for me, the couple of key takeaways was one around this whole idea of measurement and whether there are alternate ways of thinking about measurement, whether we can think about in this way of trying to figure out whether what we're doing is actually having an impact on the child, and not really thinking of measurement as something where we're trying to build competition, but measurement as a way of improving the learning experience and improving the quality of what we're offering. And this idea of one size doesn't fit all, versus also balancing the reality of the lack of resources, for example, in the global south. So that kind of dichotomy that we're struggling with. And then also some of the things that Dr. Anand said about really understanding how the mind works, which also ties into what Dr. Tara was talking about in terms of the mindfulness research, and really tying these areas of neuroscience, psychology, and really the applied sense of the things that Sonam brings to the table of actually going out and doing this work and seeing what does work and doesn't. And also the development space that Matthew comes from, of how, and also the technology space that I come from, of realizing that we all bring such valuable skill sets and perspectives into this space of social emotional learning, but how can we actually work together to build something that works for every learner everywhere, irrespective of family background, ability to pay, or the kind of schools that they go to. So that's kind of my little sum up. But this was fabulous. Thank you so much for making the time. I learned so much. I'm feeling very energized and inspired to go back at work on Monday. So yeah, thank you,
Okay,
everyone.
thank